Dr. Ethan Blake sat in his small clinic on the edge of a bustling trade hub, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. The holographic monitor above his desk flashed updates from nearby systems, but nothing caught his attention. Life on this neutral planet was simple, treating miners, merchants, and the occasional adventurous explorer who bit off more than they could chew. Just as Ethan began filing away the day's reports, a strange sound broke the silence. It was a faint beep coming from a dusty communication device he hadn't used in months. Frowning, he stood up and tapped the panel. The screen flickered to life, showing an encrypted message. Coordinates. Urgent assistance required. Help. The voice on the recording was weak, almost broken. Ethan leaned in, straining to hear more, but the message cut off. Odd, he muttered to himself, staring at the screen. Whoever sent the signal was desperate, and the coordinates pointed to a remote area outside the city, a place notorious for smugglers and bounty hunters. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to ignore it. He had a peaceful life here, far from the chaos of galactic politics. But something in that voice pulled at him. He knew what desperation sounded like. He had heard it too many times during his military days as a field medic. Grabbing his medical bag and an emergency survival kit, Ethan set off in his speeder. The vehicle hummed quietly as it glided over the rocky terrain. The farther he went, the darker it became. The twin moons overhead offered little light, and the shadows of jagged rocks loomed like silent sentinels. As he approached the coordinates, his speeder's sensors picked up signs of a crash. Smoke billowed from the wreckage of a sleek alien transport ship. Ethan slowed down, his heart pounding. Whoever was inside might not have much time. Jumping out of the speeder, he scanned the area with his flashlight. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called out. A faint groan answered him. Following the sound, Ethan found her. A young alien woman, her silvery skin shimmering under the moonlight. She was pinned beneath a twisted piece of the ship's hull, her breathing shallow. Blood, dark and thick, seeped from a wound on her side. Kneeling beside her, Ethan assessed her injuries. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing an otherworldly violet hue. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "Please, help," she rasped. "Don't worry, I'm here," Ethan said, his voice steady. He quickly injected her with a universal stabilizer, a serum designed to work on most alien physiologies. With careful effort, he managed to free her from the wreckage. She winced in pain but didn't cry out. As he worked, Ethan noticed an emblem on her tattered clothing, a royal insignia. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just any alien. She was part of the royal family of the Sorethian Empire. The implications hit him like a freight train. If she was here, it meant trouble. Big trouble. Before he could think further, his speeder's alert system beeped. A patrol was approaching. Ethan turned to see 3 figures in the distance, their weapons glinting under the moonlight. Bounty hunters. Great, he muttered. He had seen their kind before, merciless and greedy. If they found the girl, they wouldn't hesitate to take her in for the reward, dead or alive. "Stay with me," Ethan said to the girl, hoisting her onto his shoulder. She was lighter than he expected, her body frail from the injury. Moving quickly, he carried her to his speeder and placed her inside. The bounty hunters were closing in, their hoverbikes kicking up clouds of dust. Ethan had no choice but to drive. Slamming his foot on the accelerator, the speeder roared to life, zipping away just as the hunters opened fire. Blaster shots streaked past them, lighting up the dark terrain. "Hang on," Ethan shouted as he maneuvered through the rocky landscape. The girl groaned in pain but clung to consciousness. The speeder's shields held up against the attacks, but they wouldn't last long. Ethan's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. His clinic was too far away, and the bounty hunters would track them. He needed to hide, buy time to stabilize her condition. Spotting a narrow canyon ahead, He veered into it, hoping to lose their pursuers. The speeder screeched to a halt behind a large boulder. Ethan turned to the girl, her breathing shallow. He checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Suddenly, the bounty hunters' voices echoed through the canyon. They were close. Ethan reached for his medical bag and pulled out a small energy flare. It wasn't a weapon, but it could create a blinding flash. He held it tightly, his heart pounding. "Let's hope this works," he murmured as the footsteps grew louder. The flare went off with a blinding light, disorienting the bounty hunters. Using the distraction, Ethan carried the girl deeper into the canyon, his mind focused on one thing: keeping her alive. As the light faded, the bounty hunters cursed loudly, vowing to find their target. Ethan pressed on, determined. He didn't know who this girl was or why she was here, but one thing was clear: her survival depended on him. And his quiet life was about to get much more complicated. Escape through the shadows. The canyon was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of Ethan's speeder cooling down and Silara's labored breathing. The bounty hunters weren't far behind. Ethan could hear their angry shouts echoing off the canyon walls. He crouched beside the injured alien girl, his mind racing. Every decision mattered now. Zilara's eyes fluttered open briefly, her violet gaze clouded with pain. They'll find us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not if I can help it," Ethan replied firmly. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a hypo spray, injecting her with a stronger stabilizer. It wouldn't heal her, but it would keep her alive for a little longer. Ethan peered around the boulder that concealed them. The bounty hunters were combing the area with searchlights, their hoverbikes creating trails of dust. One of them barked orders to the others. "Spread out. The royal brat can't have gone far. Double the reward if she's alive." Ethan clenched his jaw. The girl wasn't just some random member of the Sorethian royal family. She was clearly important enough to put a massive target on her back. But why was she here, in the middle of nowhere? Questions swirled in his mind, but there wasn't time to dwell on them. "Can you move at all?" Ethan asked Zilara, keeping his voice low. She shook her head weakly. I can try." "No, don't strain yourself," Ethan said. He hoisted her up carefully, feeling the tension in her frail body. She was far lighter than he expected, her silvery skin cold to the touch. Her breathing remained shallow, each inhale a struggle. Moving as quietly as possible, Ethan crept deeper into the canyon, keeping close to the shadows. The towering walls on either side created a natural labyrinth, but it wouldn't be enough to lose the bounty hunters for long. They had tracking tech, probably advanced enough to pick up their trail if he didn't act fast. As he navigated the narrow path, Zilara stirred slightly. Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. Ethan didn't stop moving. "Let's just say it's a bad habit of mine. Besides, leaving you to die didn't seem like the right thing to do." Her lips twitched into a faint smile, but it quickly faded as a sharp pain racked her body. Ethan adjusted his grip, his determination hardening. He wasn't going to let her die. Not on his watch. Up ahead, the canyon opened into a small rocky clearing. A cluster of jagged stones formed a natural cave-like structure. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Ethan slipped inside and gently laid Zilara down, shielding her from the chilly night air with his jacket. "I need to buy us some time," he said, pulling out a small holographic beacon from his survival kit. "This should throw them off our trail." The beacon emitted a faint hum as Ethan activated it. It projected a false heat signature a few hundred meters away, mimicking the presence of a living being. With any luck, the hunters would take the bait. Just as he finished setting up the device, a sharp sound pierced the air. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The hunters were closer than he thought. "Spread out. Check the caves," one of them shouted. Ethan pressed himself against the cold stone wall. his mind racing. He glanced at Solara, who was barely conscious. If they found her, it would be over. He couldn't fight them head-on. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but he could outsmart them. Reaching into his bag, Ethan pulled out a small vial of compressed gas, a sedative he used for medical emergencies. He rigged it to a makeshift detonator, his hands working quickly but steadily. It wasn't a weapon, but it could knock out anyone within a few meters. The first hunter entered the clearing, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Ethan watched from the shadows, holding his breath. The hunter scanned the area, his weapon at the ready. "Nothing here," he muttered, turning toward the cave. Ethan waited until the man was close enough, then rolled the gas vial toward him. The device hissed as it released the sedative, and the hunter staggered, coughing violently before collapsing to the ground. One down. Ethan quickly dragged the unconscious man out of sight, then checked on Solara. She was still breathing, but her condition wasn't improving. He needed to get her to proper medical equipment, and soon. The sound of another hunter approaching snapped him back to the moment. This one was more cautious, his movements deliberate. He called out to his fallen comrade, but there was no response. "Stay alert," he warned the others. "They're here somewhere." Ethan's pulse quickened. The sedative trick wouldn't work again. They'd be expecting it. He needed another plan. Suddenly, Solara stirred, her hand weakly grabbing his arm. "Ethan," she whispered. Save your strength," he replied, gently pressing her back down. "No, my bracelet," she said, her fingers brushing the ornate device on her wrist. Ethan hadn't noticed it before, but the bracelet was glowing faintly, emitting a soft hum. "What does it do?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Solara managed a faint smile. "Trust me." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then pressed the small gem in the center of the bracelet. The hum grew louder, and a holographic projection erupted from the device. It displayed a complex array of symbols and shapes that Ethan couldn't understand, but Solara's expression told him everything. "It's a distress signal," she said, her voice gaining a hint of strength. "Help is coming." Ethan felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The hunters were closing in, their voices growing louder. They wouldn't wait for reinforcements to arrive. "Let's hope they get here before we're out of options," Ethan muttered. He grabbed a small flare from his bag, ready to create another distraction. The hunters were just outside the clearing now, their flashlights sweeping across the rocks. Ethan's grip tightened around the flare, his mind racing with possibilities. Then, out of nowhere, a loud roar echoed through the canyon. The hunters froze, their weapons raised. The sound was otherworldly, guttural, and terrifying. Ethan turned to Solara, who smiled faintly. "They're here," she whispered before slipping into unconsciousness. Ethan's gaze shifted to the canyon entrance, where shadows began to move. Whoever, or whatever, had answered the distress signal was closing in, and it wasn't just here to talk. The king's secret. The ground trembled as the distant roar echoed through the canyon, sending a wave of fear through the bounty hunters. They stopped in their tracks, weapons drawn, scanning the shadows for the source of the sound. Ethan's heart raced as he crouched next to Solara, her frail body slumped against the cave wall. "They're here," Solara had whispered before passing out. But who were they? Reinforcements from the Torithian Empire, or something else entirely? The first sign of movement came from above. Silhouettes danced along the ridge of the canyon, sleek and predatory. Ethan squinted, barely making out their forms against the dim moonlight. They weren't human. "Ambush," one of the bounty hunters shouted, firing his blaster into the darkness. The others followed suit, unleashing a flurry of red-hot energy bolts. The shots illuminated the figures briefly, tall, armored warriors with glowing eyes that pierced through the night. The bounty hunters didn't stand a chance. The first warrior leaped from the ridge, landing with a force that cracked the ground beneath him. He moved with precision, disarming the nearest hunter in seconds and knocking him unconscious. The others tried to scatter, but the warriors closed in swiftly, their movements a blur of efficiency. Ethan stayed frozen in the shadows, his mind racing. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Their armor bore the royal insignia of the Xorithian Empire, and their weapons were far more advanced than anything the hunters had. Before Ethan could process what was happening, one of the warriors turned toward the cave, his glowing eyes locked onto Ethan's hiding spot. Panic surged through Ethan's veins. He instinctively reached for the flare in his bag, but a deep, resonant voice stopped him. "Do not move, human," the warrior said, stepping closer. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. "You are not our enemy." Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the flare. "I'm here to help her," he said, gesturing to Zilara. "She's hurt." The warrior tilted his head, studying Ethan for a moment before nodding. "You're the medic who answered the signal." "Yes," Ethan replied cautiously. "And who are you?" The warrior didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched beside Zilara, his armored hand gently brushing the bracelet on her wrist. The device emitted a soft glow, and the holographic symbols flickered briefly before fading. The warrior turned back to Ethan. "She is Princess Zilara, heir to the Xorithian throne," he said, "and you have saved her life." Ethan's stomach dropped. He had suspected she was important, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. "I didn't know who she was. I just couldn't leave her." The warrior stood, his towering form casting a long shadow over Ethan. "Your actions may have saved the future of our empire, but your presence here complicates things." Ethan frowned. "Complicates things? I'm the one who kept her alive while bounty hunters were chasing us. If I hadn't stepped in, she'd be dead by now." The warrior's glowing eyes softened slightly. "Your service is noted, human, but the enemies of the throne will not rest until they have her. By helping her, you've painted a target on yourself." Before Ethan could respond, Zilara stirred. Her violet eyes fluttered open, and she let out a weak groan. The warrior knelt beside her immediately, his tone softening. "Princess, you're safe now. We've neutralized the threat." Zilara's gaze shifted to Ethan, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "He saved me," she said, her voice barely audible. The warrior nodded. "Yes, Princess, and we owe him a great debt." Ethan sighed, sitting back against the wall. "You're welcome," he muttered. "But I still don't understand what's going on. Why was she being hunted?" The warrior hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "There is a device, a powerful artifact entrusted to the royal family. It has the potential to unite or destroy entire civilizations. Princess Zilara was tasked with its protection, but an internal betrayal led to the attack on her transport." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "An artifact that can destroy civilizations. Sounds like something worth keeping quiet about." "It's more than that," the warrior said gravely. "The artifact is a key to the celestial nexus, a source of unimaginable energy that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. The coup against the royal family aims to seize control of it." Ethan stared at the warrior, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "And she's the only one who can access it, isn't she?" The warrior nodded. "The artifact responds to her bloodline. Without her, it is useless." Ethan looked down at Zilara, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. Her fragile state suddenly seemed even more precarious. "Then we need to get her somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they can't find her." The warrior stood, his armor glinting faintly in the moonlight. "There is a secure facility nearby where we can regroup, but we'll need your help to stabilize her condition during transport." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll do whatever it takes." The journey to the facility was tense. Zilara lay in the back of the transport vehicle, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan worked tirelessly, monitoring her vitals and administering small doses of medicine to keep her stable. The warriors drove in silence, their watchful eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of pursuit. When they finally arrived, Ethan was struck by the sheer scale of the facility. hidden beneath a massive cliffside. It was a fortress of advanced technology and defenses. The air buzzed with the hum of energy shields and the low thrum of automated turrets. Inside, Ethan was ushered into a sterile medical chamber, where he continued treating Zilara. The warriors kept their distance, watching him closely but saying little. After what felt like hours, Zilara finally opened her eyes fully. Her color had returned, and her breathing was stronger. "You did it," she whispered, her gaze meeting Ethan's. He smiled wearily. "You're not out of the woods yet, princess, but you're going to be okay." Before Zilara could respond, the doors to the chamber opened, and an imposing figure entered. He was tall, with an air of authority that immediately filled the room. His ornate armor gleamed, and his piercing violet eyes left no doubt about his identity. "Father," Zilara said weakly. King Soreth stepped forward, his expression a mix of relief and anger. He looked at Ethan, his eyes narrowing. "You are the human who saved my daughter." Ethan stood, meeting the king's gaze. "Yes, and I'd do it again." The king studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You have my gratitude, human. But know this, your involvement has placed you in the middle of a war far greater than you can imagine." Ethan crossed his arms, exhaustion and frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't ask for any of this, but if it means keeping her safe, I'm in." The king's expression softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You are brave, human. Perhaps foolish, but brave." As the king turned to leave, he paused. "There is much you do not know about our empire and the artifact. Rest while you can. Tomorrow, your real journey begins." Ethan sighed, leaning back against the wall. He had a sinking feeling the king was right. An uneasy alliance. The medical chamber hummed with the soft glow of diagnostic monitors as Ethan leaned against a wall, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. Zilara was stable now, resting quietly under the care of the facility's advanced systems, but the weight of everything he'd learned was pressing down on him like a heavy stone. An artifact capable of galactic destruction, a coup within the Sorathian royal family. And now, he was tangled in a web of intrigue that stretched far beyond his understanding. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had signed up to help people, not to get caught in the middle of a war. The sound of heavy footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see one of the Sorathian warriors entering the chamber. It was the same one who had found him in the canyon, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. "The king wishes to speak with you," the warrior said, his voice as firm and measured as before. Ethan straightened, his weariness replaced by a growing irritation. "Let me guess. He wants to lecture me about how I'm in over my head." The warrior's glowing eyes narrowed slightly. "You saved the princess's life. That is no small feat. But the king does not trust easily, especially not a human." Ethan frowned but followed the warrior through the facility's winding corridors. The air was crisp and cold, the faint hum of energy shields a constant reminder of the advanced technology surrounding them. Soldiers passed by, their expressions stoic, but Ethan could feel their eyes on him. To them, he was an outsider, a potential liability. Finally, they reached a large chamber at the heart of the facility. The room was dominated by a holographic map of the galaxy, its glowing points of light representing key strategic locations. King Soreth stood at the center, his presence commanding even in silence. Around him were several advisors, each adorned in intricate robes that marked their rank. The king turned as Ethan entered, his piercing gaze locking onto him. "Human," he began, his tone measured but cold. "You have proven yourself capable, but your involvement in our affairs was not by choice. I must ask, why do you continue to stay?" Ethan crossed his arms, meeting the king's gaze without flinching. "Because I couldn't just walk away. Your daughter needed help, and now that I know what's at stake, I can't ignore it. If you want me gone, fine. But if you're asking me why I care, it's because someone has to." The room fell silent. Several advisors exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. King Soreth studied Ethan for a long moment before nodding. A bold answer. Perhaps there is more to you than meets the eye. One of the advisors stepped forward, her voice sharp. My king, trusting an outsider, especially a human, is a risk we cannot afford. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're right. Trusting me is a risk, but so is doing nothing. If you want to keep debating, fine. Meanwhile, your enemies are out there planning their next move. The advisor opened her mouth to retort, but the king raised a hand, silencing her. Enough, he said. The human is right. Time is not on our side. He turned back to Ethan. We have intelligence that suggests the traitors within our ranks are planning to move the artifact to an off-world location. If they succeed, we will lose any chance of reclaiming it. I need you to help ensure that does not happen. Ethan blinked in surprise. Me? What can I do that your soldiers can't? King Soreth gestured to the map. The traitors know our methods. They will anticipate our soldiers and counter their moves. But you are unpredictable. A human outsider with no ties to our empire. You can move where we cannot. Ethan glanced at the map, his mind racing. This wasn't what he signed up for, but he couldn't deny the logic in the king's words. What exactly are you asking me to do? The king stepped closer, his expression grave. You will work with a team of my most trusted warriors. Your mission is to infiltrate the traitor's base, retrieve the artifact, and ensure it does not fall into the wrong hands. My daughter will accompany you. Ethan's eyes widened. Zilara. She's barely recovered. She shouldn't be out there risking her life. The king's gaze hardened. The artifact will only respond to her. Without her, the mission is doomed to fail. Before Ethan could argue further, the doors to the chamber opened, and Zilara entered, her steps steady but deliberate. She wore light combat armor, her silvery skin glowing faintly under the chamber's lights. Despite her fragile appearance, her eyes burned with determination. I'm going, she said, her voice leaving no room for debate. This is my responsibility. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're as stubborn as your father, aren't you? Zilara allowed herself a faint smile. I'll take that as a compliment. The team gathered in the briefing room, a mix of seasoned Sorethian warriors and Ethan, the lone human among them. The plan was laid out in meticulous detail, a covert operation to infiltrate a fortified base on a nearby moon. The base was heavily guarded, but intelligence suggested a weak point in their defenses that could be exploited. As they prepared to depart, Ethan found himself standing beside Zilara, adjusting the straps on his medical bag. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked quietly. She glanced at him, her expression softening. No, but readiness doesn't matter when the stakes are this high. I have to try. Ethan nodded, respecting her resolve. Just promise me one thing. If things go south, you stick with me. I can't patch you up if you're halfway across the battlefield. Zilara's smile widened slightly. Deal. The journey to the moon was tense. The transport ship was silent save for the hum of its engines. Ethan sat across from Zilara, his thoughts a whirlwind of worry and anticipation. The warriors around them remained stoic, their confidence unwavering. When the ship finally touched down, the team moved with practiced efficiency. The moon's surface was barren and cold, its dark landscape illuminated only by the distant glow of the base. Ethan adjusted his gear, his heart pounding as they approached the facility. The team split into two groups, one to create a diversion, the other to infiltrate the base. Ethan found himself alongside Zilara and a few warriors, their steps careful and deliberate. The base loomed ahead, its towering walls covered in automated turrets. Stay close, Zilara whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on his medical bag. As they reached the outer perimeter, the first group's diversion kicked off. Explosions rocked the facility, drawing guards away from their posts. Ethan and his group slipped inside, moving quickly through dimly lit corridors. But as they neared the artifact's location, a voice crackled through the comms. "They're onto us," one of the warriors warned. "Prepare for resistance." Ethan's pulse quickened. The uneasy alliance was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible. Into enemy hands. The air inside the enemy base was thick with tension. Every step Ethan took felt heavier, each breath slower, as he followed Zilara and the Everthian warriors deeper into the labyrinth of cold, metallic corridors. The sounds of distant alarms echoed faintly through the walls, a haunting reminder that their divergent team was engaged in a deadly game above ground. Ethan's grip on his medical bag tightened. He wasn't a soldier, but here he was, in the middle of an alien stronghold, with the princess of an empire relying on him. He glanced at Zilara. Despite her earlier injuries, she moved with determination, her violet eyes scanning every shadow for danger. It was clear that her royal upbringing had prepared her for moments like this, but even royalty wasn't invincible. "Stay close," whispered one of the warriors ahead of them. His voice was barely audible over the hum of the facility's machinery. Ethan nodded, his nerves fraying with each passing second. They had one objective: retrieve the artifact and escape. Simple in theory, impossible in practice. The artifact's chamber. The group rounded a corner and halted abruptly. Before them stood a massive door, its surface inscribed with alien runes that pulsed faintly with energy. Zilara stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the symbols as if they spoke to her. "This is it," she murmured, her voice laced with both awe and dread. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze shifting between Zilara and the door. "How do we get it open?" Zilara raised her wrist, revealing the bracelet she had activated back in the canyon. As she pressed its central gem, the runes on the door flared to life, casting an eerie glow across the corridor. The sound of grinding metal filled the air as the door slowly slid open, revealing the chamber beyond. Inside, the artifact sat on a raised pedestal, its appearance both mesmerizing and alien. It was a crystalline structure, shifting colors in a way that made it seem alive. Tendrils of light spiraled out from its core, connecting to the walls like veins. The air around it felt charged, almost electric. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off it. "That doesn't look like something we should be messing with." Zilara stepped forward, her movements cautious. "It's more than a weapon. It's a conduit, a key to the celestial nexus. My family has guarded it for generations." One of the warriors spoke up, his tone urgent. "We don't have time for explanations. Grab the artifact and let's move." As Zilara reached for the artifact, a sharp noise shattered the tense silence. Footsteps. Dozens of them, growing louder by the second. Ethan spun around, his heart sinking as he saw shadows flickering against the walls. "They're here," whispered another warrior, drawing his weapon. Ambushed. The first wave of enemy soldiers stormed into the corridor, their armor glinting under the artifact's glow. Blaster fire erupted, the sound deafening in the confined space. The Everthian warriors moved like a well-oiled machine, returning fire with precision. Ethan ducked behind a console, clutching his medical bag as chaos erupted around him. Zilara stood firm by the artifact, her bracelet emitting a protective barrier that shielded her from the stray blasts. She glanced at Ethan, her voice cutting through the noise. "We need to protect the artifact at all costs." "Easier said than done," Ethan shouted back, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He wasn't a fighter, but he grabbed a small energy shield from one of the warriors' packs and crouched low, trying to make himself as small a target as possible. The Everthian warriors held their ground, but the enemy forces kept coming. Ethan's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything that could tip the odds in their favor. His eyes landed on a panel near the entrance, its alien symbols flashing in a rhythmic pattern. "What does that do?" he called out, pointing to the panel. Zilara followed his gaze, her eyes widening. "It's a lockdown mechanism. If we activate it, we can trap them inside, but we'll be stuck too." Ethan gritted his teeth. Better stuck than dead. Zilara nodded, sprinting toward the panel. As she worked to activate the lockdown, Ethan spotted an enemy soldier aiming at her. Without thinking, he grabbed a small stunner from his bag and hurled it at the soldier. The device hit its mark, sending the enemy sprawling to the ground. "Nice throw, medic," one of the warriors muttered, firing another volley at the advancing troops. Zilara slammed her hand against the panel, and the chamber shuddered. Massive doors began to slide shut, cutting off the flow of enemy reinforcements. But not before one final figure slipped through. A man clad in dark armor, his presence radiating authority. Ethan recognized him instantly. This was no ordinary soldier. This was the leader of the coup. The general. The man stepped forward, his voice cold and calculating. "Princess Zilara," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You've made it farther than I expected." Zilara straightened, her chin held high. "You'll never take the artifact, General Valric. It belongs to my family, to our empire." Valric chuckled darkly. "Your family's reign is over, child. The artifact is wasted on them. Under my command, it will bring true order to the galaxy." Ethan clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You mean destruction, don't you?" Valric turned to him, his expression unreadable. "And who is this? A human? How quaint. Tell me, human, do you even understand what you've involved yourself in?" "I understand enough to know you're not the kind of guy who should have that thing," Ethan shot back, gesturing to the artifact. Valric's eyes narrowed. Brave words. But bravery won't save you. With a flick of his wrist, Valric activated a device on his armor. The artifact pulsed violently, its tendrils of light expanding and lashing out like living things. Zilara cried out, clutching her bracelet as the protective barrier around her faltered. Ethan rushed to her side, his medical training kicking in. "Zilara, what's happening?" "He's trying to force it to activate," she gasped. "If he succeeds, the energy release will kill everyone in this room." Ethan's mind raced. "Then we stop him. Tell me what to do." Zilara hesitated, then handed him her bracelet. "The artifact responds to this. You'll need to get close enough to disrupt the connection." Ethan stared at the bracelet, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're kidding, right? You want me to walk into that?" Zilara met his gaze, her expression steady. "You saved me before. I trust you." Before he could argue, Valric's voice rang out. "Enough games. The artifact will be mine." Ethan tightened the bracelet around his wrist, the device humming with energy. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Guess I'm the hero now." Dodging blaster fire and arcs of energy from the artifact, Ethan sprinted toward the pedestal. The tendrils of light lashed out at him, but the bracelet's energy shield held firm. With every step, the artifact's power grew stronger, the air around it crackling with intensity. Finally, he reached the pedestal. Summoning every ounce of courage, he pressed the bracelet against the artifact. The two devices clashed, their energies colliding in a blinding explosion of light. Captured. When the light faded, Ethan found himself on the ground, his body aching but alive. The artifact was silent, its glow dimmed. Valric stood a few feet away, his armor scorched but intact. His expression was one of fury and frustration. "You think this is over?" Valric growled. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Before Ethan could react, Valric's soldiers stormed the chamber, overpowering the remaining warriors. Zilara cried out as they seized her, and Ethan felt rough hands grabbing him, dragging him to his feet. Valric sneered. "Take them both. We'll finish this elsewhere." As they were dragged away, Ethan locked eyes with Zilara. Despite their capture, her gaze held a glimmer of hope. "We'll get through this," she whispered. Ethan nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "Yeah, we will." The ultimate sacrifice. Ethan's head throbbed as he regained consciousness. His vision blurred, and the faint hum of alien machinery buzzed in his ears. Slowly, the surroundings came into focus. A cold, sterile chamber with walls of polished steel. Restraints bound his wrists and ankles to a chair bolted to the floor. Across from him, Zilara sat similarly restrained, her expression defiant despite the bruises on her face. Finally awake, human. General Valric's voice cut through the haze, cold and sharp. Ethan turned his head to see the coup's leader standing in the center of the room, flanked by two heavily armed guards. The artifact hovered behind him, suspended in a containment field, its pulsing light dim but ominous. Ethan glared at the general. "You're wasting your time. You're not going to win this." Valric chuckled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Ah, the human optimism. So quaint. Do you really think this is about winning or losing? This is about reshaping the galaxy." Zilara spat, her voice laced with venom. "You're nothing but a traitor. My father trusted you, and you betrayed him for power." Valric's expression darkened, and he stepped closer to Zilara. "Your father's reign is weak, princess. He clings to ancient traditions while the galaxy descends into chaos. With the artifact, I will bring order, true order." Ethan struggled against his restraints. "Your kind of order sounds a lot like tyranny." Valric smirked. "Call it what you will, human. History is written by the victors." A shocking revelation. Before Valric could continue, one of his guards approached, whispering something in his ear. The general's eyes narrowed. He turned to a nearby console, activating a holographic map of the galaxy. Red markers flared across several key locations. "It seems your father has finally decided to act, princess," Valric said, his tone laced with mock amusement. "The royal fleet is en route. A desperate attempt to rescue his precious daughter." Zilara's eyes widened. "He'll stop you." Valric laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber. "He'll fail. By the time his ships arrive, I'll have activated the artifact. With its power, I'll crush his fleet and seize the throne." Ethan's heart sank. "You can't activate it without her," he said, nodding toward Zilara. "It's tied to her bloodline, right?" Valric's smirk widened. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. I don't need her alive to activate it. A simple blood sample will suffice." The color drained from Zilara's face, but she quickly masked her fear with a defiant glare. "You won't succeed." Valric ignored her, turning to his guards. "Prepare the extraction chamber. We'll take what we need and dispose of the rest." Ethan's mind raced. He had to act fast, but with the restraints and armed guards, their chances of escape seemed non-existent. Then his eyes fell on Zilara's bracelet, still faintly glowing on her wrist. If he could somehow use its connection to the artifact. The escape plan. As the guards moved to unchain Zilara, Ethan spoke up, his tone casual despite the pounding in his chest. "Hey, Valric, you ever wonder why no one trusts guys like you?" Valric turned to him, irritation flickering across his face. "And what, pray tell, do you mean by that?" "You're predictable," Ethan said, forcing a smirk. "Big speeches, lots of posturing, and then you always underestimate the little guy." Valric snorted. "Is that supposed to intimidate me, human?" "No," Ethan replied, his smirk widening. "It's supposed to distract you." With that, Zilara activated her bracelet. A burst of energy erupted from it, short-circuiting her restraints and sending a pulse through the chamber. The guards staggered, their weapons sparking as the containment field around the artifact flickered. Ethan seized the moment, using his now-freed hands to grab a fallen guard's stunner. He fired a quick shot, hitting one of the guards square in the chest. Zilara, moving with surprising agility despite her injuries, tackled the second guard, knocking his weapon from his hands. Valric, stunned by the sudden turn of events, reached for a control panel, but Ethan was faster. He slammed the stunner against the console, sending a cascade of sparks flying. The artifact, now uncontained, pulsed violently, its tendrils of light lashing out at random. "Ethan," Zilara called out, "we have to stop it before it destabilizes." Ethan nodded, but before he could respond, Valrek lunged at him. The two men grappled, their struggle sending them crashing into the console. The artifact's glow intensified, and the room began to shake. The ultimate choice. Zilara rushed to the artifact, her bracelet glowing brighter as she extended her hand toward it. "I can stabilize it," she shouted over the chaos. "But it'll drain me completely." Ethan broke free from Valrek's grip, his eyes locking onto hers. "What do you mean? Drain you?" Zilara hesitated, her expression softening. "If I fully connect with the artifact, it'll consume my life force to contain its energy. It's the only way to stop it." Ethan's heart clenched. "No, there has to be another way." Valrek, still recovering from the fight, laughed darkly. "There is no other way. Let her sacrifice herself. It's fitting for a royal to die for her people." Ethan glared at Valrek, fury boiling in his chest. "Shut up." He turned back to Zilara, desperation in his voice. "We'll find another way. We just need time." Zilara shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "We don't have time, Ethan. If the artifact destabilizes, it'll destroy this entire facility and everyone on the planet." Ethan's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to protect her, to find a solution that didn't involve losing her. But the look in her eyes told him she had already made her decision. "Don't do this," he pleaded. "There's still so much you can do, so much you can be." She smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And because of you, I've learned what it means to fight for something greater than myself. Thank you, Ethan." Before he could stop her, Zilara pressed her bracelet against the artifact. A surge of energy erupted, enveloping her in a blinding light. Ethan shielded his eyes, his heart breaking as he heard her gasp, followed by a deafening silence. When the light faded, the artifact was dim, its energy contained. Zilara lay motionless on the floor, her once glowing skin now dull and lifeless. The aftermath. Ethan fell to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he cradled her in his arms. "Zilara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't have to." Behind him, Valrek stirred, but before he could act, the remaining Xorathian warriors burst into the chamber, weapons drawn. They quickly subdued the general and his guards, their leader's face etched with grief as he took in the scene. King Xorath entered moments later, his expression hardening as he saw his daughter's lifeless form. He knelt beside Ethan, his hand resting on Zilara's shoulder. "She saved us all," the king said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. "She was brave, more than any of us deserved." A faint spark. As the king stood to address his warriors, Ethan noticed something. A faint glow emanating from Zilara's bracelet. The artifact pulsed gently, as if responding to her. Her body stirred slightly, and her eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Zilara." She smiled faintly. "I told you. I'd fight. To the end. A new era." Ethan knelt beside Zilara, his heart racing as he watched her eyes slowly open. The faint glow from her bracelet pulsed rhythmically, a stark contrast to the once violent energy of the artifact. She looked up at him, her face pale but alive, and managed a weak smile. "You didn't think I'd let you have all the glory, did you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through him. "You really have a flair for the dramatic, princess." King Xorath stepped forward, his imposing figure softened by the deep sorrow and relief etched across his face. He knelt beside his daughter, his expression one of quiet awe. "Zilara," he said, his voice trembling. "You've done more than I could have ever asked. The artifact is safe, and the Empire owes you its future." Zilara smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to the artifact, now a dormant crystal resting on the pedestal. "It wasn't just me," she said, glancing at Ethan. "I had help." The king turned to Ethan, his violet eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. "Human," he began, his tone heavy with gratitude. "You have not only saved my daughter, but also ensured the survival of our empire. Your actions will not be forgotten." Ethan stood, still cradling Zalara's hand. He looked at the king, his exhaustion clear. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The king nodded solemnly. "Even so, your courage has earned you a place of honor among our people." The end of the coup. As the warriors secured General Valric and his remaining forces, the tension in the room finally began to ease. The coup had been crushed, and the artifact, now stable, was no longer a threat in the wrong hands. But the scars of the battle were visible everywhere: injuries, lost lives, and a galaxy left shaken by the near catastrophe. Zalara's strength slowly returned as the medics worked to stabilize her. Despite her frailty, she insisted on walking out of the chamber on her own. With Ethan's help, she stood tall, her head held high. The Exorethian warriors around them saluted her, their respect for their princess evident. Valric, bound and subdued, glared at Zalara as she approached. "You think this is over, child?" He spat. "The artifact may be safe for now, but you can't stop what's coming. The galaxy will never bow to your father's rule." Zalara met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "The galaxy doesn't need to bow. It needs unity, not fear. And that's something you'll never understand." Valric's sneer faltered, but he said nothing more as he was dragged away by the warriors. The coup's leader was defeated, but Zalara knew the fight for peace was far from over. A choice to make. Back at the royal flagship, Zalara was brought to the ship's grand medical wing, where advanced technology worked to heal the lingering effects of her ordeal. Ethan stayed by her side, refusing to leave until he was sure she was fully recovered. "You're going to make one hell of a queen someday," Ethan said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Zalara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "And what about you? What happens when all of this is over?" Ethan shrugged. "I go back to what I know, helping people. Maybe I'll reopen my clinic on that dusty little trade planet." Life there was simple. Zalara frowned, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "After everything we've been through, you'd just leave?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't belong here, Zalara. This is your world, your fight. I'm just a guy who stumbled into it." Before Zalara could respond, the doors to the medical wing opened, and King Sorath entered. His presence filled the room, but his expression was softer than before. "Ethan Blake," the king began, addressing him formally, "you have proven yourself to be more than an outsider. Your actions have shown courage, loyalty, and honor. I would like to offer you a place in my court as a royal advisor." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "A royal advisor? Me? I think you've got the wrong guy, Your Majesty. I'm a medic, not a politician." The king's lips curled into a rare smile. "Your skills go beyond medicine, Ethan. You have a way of seeing the bigger picture, of bringing people together. That is a rare gift." Ethan looked between the king and Zalara, his mind racing. The offer was tempting in its own way. A chance to be part of something greater, to make a difference on a galactic scale. But it also felt overwhelming. I need time to think about it," he said finally. The king nodded. "Take all the time you need. You have earned that and more." A new beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The royal fleet returned to the Exorethian capital, where the news of Zalara's survival and the artifact's recovery spread like wildfire. Celebrations erupted across the empire, but amidst the joy, preparations were made to rebuild what had been damaged by the coup. Zalara, now fully recovered, took on a more active role in the empire's leadership. She worked tirelessly alongside her father, advocating for reforms that would strengthen alliances with neighboring civilizations. Her experiences during the coup had changed her, giving her a deeper understanding of the galaxy's fragility and its potential. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself torn. The king's offer lingered in his mind, but his heart ached for the simplicity of his old life. He spent his days helping the Thorathian medics, using his knowledge to treat those injured in the conflict. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his quarters, gazing out at the sprawling capital city, Zilara joined him. She leaned against the railing, her expression contemplative. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it is." They stood in silence for a moment before Zilara spoke again. "You don't have to decide right away, you know. But if you do leave, I'll miss you." Ethan looked at her, his chest tightening. "You've got this, Zilara. You don't need me holding your hand." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean I don't want you here." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're stubborn, you know that." "It's a royal trait," she replied, her eyes sparkling. "A legacy begins." When the day came for Ethan to make his decision, he found himself standing before King Xareth and Zilara in the grand throne room. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he stood tall, his resolve clear. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady, "I fought long and hard about your offer. And while I'm honored, I believe my place is out there, helping people in my own way." The king nodded solemnly. "I understand. The galaxy is vast, and your skills are needed everywhere." Zilara stepped forward, her expression bittersweet. "You'll always have a place here, Ethan, no matter where you go." Ethan smiled. "And I'll always carry what I've learned here with me." As he prepared to leave, Zilara gave him a parting gift, a small crystal from the artifact, now inert but still glowing faintly. "A reminder of what we fought for," she said. Ethan took it, his heart full. "Thank you, Zilara, for everything." As he boarded a transport ship and watched the Torethian capital fade into the distance, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would carry the legacy of his time with Zilara and the Torethian people wherever he went. And somewhere, deep down, he knew their paths would cross again.